being an independent scholar in this day and age is like building relationships at scale. If I have you in my ears for 20 hours listening to your podcasts, I'm already going to have a relationship with you.
I write really freely and I say things I could never say as a professor. To me, it's a more full flourishing, my own vision for my scholarly life. But it is a desert, basically, mimetically. And that's a very serious loss.
I don't really care about raw numbers. I care a lot more about having the right people that essentially I want to be friends with viewing my stuff.
Silicon Valley will increasingly be a breakaway civilization within America. All of the money, all of the power is going to be circulating in this because it's increasingly the source of all new economic value generation.
I think there's a danger of trying to pursue the higher good without resolving the lower good. And I think one danger there is the starving artist perhaps not only loses food, but also loses his art.
All right, Johnathan. So you have embarked on this big strategy to create a brand and a kind of new sort of content empire in the humanities, focusing on great thinkers, great books. And as this is one of the things we're very interested in here in my neck of the woods, this sort of new economy around independent scholarship. And so I wanted to have you on today to just get a sense of how you're seeing this landscape, what it is exactly you're trying to build, and the strategic calculations that have gone into how you're designing your project. So I want to hear, what are you thinking? How are you trying to crack this nut of building a viable, impactful, but independent scholarly project on the internet? So why don't we just start with, give us a little bit of a rundown of the project. What exactly are you building? What are the basic parameters of your project?
So my project is called Great Books of the West. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's a lecture and interview series. On the lecturing side, every lecture, they're about 2 hours long monologues. I invite about 70 or so of my friends in New York to film it, just like a classroom seminar. And then they cover sort of the essence of a great book. So we've done Nietzsche's genealogy, we've done Rousseau's first and second discourse. And in July, we're going to do Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. So fiction as well as philosophy. And on the interviews, they're supposed to be deep dives. So once you get the introduction to a great book, you might want to understand the deeper pulses of that thinker. And in Nietzsche, one example is Nietzsche's critique of free will, right? And so the interviews are usually ideas of the great thinker that spans across books. But the curiosity is probably pulled by the introduction to that one great book, right? So it's almost like a T-shape where you go really deep into one book and then there's an idea that you're interested in. And so the interviews are supposed to be supplements, and they're about an hour to 2 hours long. And they're with the world-class scholars in their fields. I've done 2 at UChicago, 2 at Columbia, and 1 at Boston College, emeritus. And they're all around a seminal piece of secondary work that that scholar has written. And so that's the general shape of the project.
And now you have a background in startups and business, and you recently found some success with some of the companies you were building with Joe Lonsdale. And then after you decided to take a step away from the business world and embark on this project, one of the things that's interesting about the way you're doing it is you're very interested in the high production value. You sent me some of the clips of the lectures that you're doing. It's this wood paneled lecture hall that you seem to be renting out. And it's really kind of, you're going really big in terms of making it look really swanky and things like that. And so I'm curious about how you see the economics of it all. Is this going to become a big business? If so, how is it going to pay back the costs? Give us a sense of like the business landscape and the calculations that you're making when you carved out what this project is going to look like.
Yeah, so would it be okay if I gave an overview of why I'm doing this? Because I think that will, like, really answering that why question will help
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
that will also give our listeners a background about me. So I was born in Beijing, really born and raised in Beijing. And my sort of one-liner is that Beijing is the most Western city in the world. If by Western, we mean modern West, like technocratic, anti-metaphysical, very pragmatic, aspiring to a clean break from history. And I think most modern education systems are like this, where they push you away from the humanities, right? And this wasn't always true. Nietzsche, for example, he was pushed away from mathematics and pushed towards classics, right? That's what the smartest people did. And so in my upbringing, I was pushed to mathematics and I was taught to look down upon the humanities. And so even all the way up until college, I went to Columbia to study computer science. And I dropped out my freshman spring to build a company that eventually failed. And so I got into philosophy as a form of consolation, as a form of self-diagnosis of what had gone wrong. And so my engagement into philosophy was always very practical. It was always very, how do I live a good life? And so even when philosophy takes me down these weird metaphysical rabbit holes, I think there's a very practical question behind all of it. I eventually got into Girard, who I did a 7-part lecture series on, and we did an interview on that. And that's what initially gave me the idea of doing this lecture series. And so just to back up a little bit, I think this will still be interesting to your audience. After I met philosophy, it was like a drug. I could not get enough. I think you have a metaphor where you say philosophy is like doing the hardest drug or something. And once you're on it, you just want to try to find the most extreme takes possible. And that was definitely me. I had both a CS degree and had studied philosophy.
Historically, a lot of people refer to philosophy as a kind of a conversion experience. Many people have testified to this sort of thing. And it's not for nothing that sort of the great philosophers and the great saints have a similar conviction around their calling.
Yeah, and I believe there's a great biography about Augustine called Augustine of Hippo that detailed how his conversion into philosophy, so away from the active life towards the contemplative life, actually prefaced his sort of conversion of faith. That he was this hyper-tracked lawyer, essentially, right, in Rome, and he was like writing speeches for the emperor, and he just gave it all away. And he got a villa near Lake Como, I think, or something like that, with a bunch of his friends, and he aspired to live a life of not self-imposed exile, but an Epicurean life of retreat, perhaps. And then it was through all these various things that he got pulled into being a bishop. But anyways, that's another story. Okay, that is to say, I guess what I'm trying to say is I was pulled both by the active and contemplative life. And frankly, I'm quite upset that they're not as well integrated. I'm doing an interview next Monday about a book called The Roman Republic of Letters. And it detailed how people like Julius Caesar, Brutus, Cicero, obviously, were not just actors, men of action in their day, but they were some of the leading scholars in their field. Like apparently when Caesar was scaling the Alps with his legions, he was writing a treatise on Roman oratory. And that was like one of the definitive treaties that people responded to. I suppose one way of thinking about this project is I'm trying to combine the active and the contemplative life. When I was still in college and deciding what I wanted to do afterwards, I wanted to do a philosophy PhD. That's what I wanted to do. That was where my passion was. I'd become obsessed with Girard and Hegel, Rousseau, Nietzsche. But there was something off that I couldn't quite put into words about philosophy PhDs. And the way I would frame it is, it seemed like, especially as they got closer and closer to the job market, and especially early professors, you'll be able to speak a lot more to this, they were miserable. And I didn't really know why, but that was the empirical fact. And so for me, I was like, if I'm doing this for the good life, but philosophy, the way that people practice philosophy now is going to prevent me from the good life, or prevents a lot of people from the good life, it seems, then what's the point of doing this? And so it was because of that I didn't end up doing a philosophy PhD, but instead try to establish myself financially and socially first. And so I went to build a company, which was not what I wanted to do at all. Or that's a bit strong. It was by far the second choice. But I wanted to establish myself. You know, I think that in our lives, there's a Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I think there's a danger of trying to pursue the higher good without resolving the lower good. And I think one danger there is the starving artist perhaps not only loses food, but also loses his art. And what I mean by that is, if you need your art to make money for you, like immediately, tomorrow, then you'll succumb to all these different pressures of the market that you might not, right? And by the way, there's a country analogy of this. I think one of the African leaders, he sent one of his citizens to Oxford, and he went up to Lee Kuan Yew, and he was very proud that he sent the guy to study classics. And Lee Kuan Yew basically did the verbal equivalent of slapping him across the face and be like, you guys don't even have plumbing yet. And do you see what I'm trying to say here? That as with the individual, alongside the country, there's a sort of step order of what thing you want to satisfy in life first. And for me, it seemed I wanted to satisfy, obviously, health. I had that already, and finances was the next step. So yeah. I built a company, and I tried to build it in the most contemplative domain, which I conceive to be finance and investing. So we built a wealth management platform, and it was going really well. I was supposed to stay there for 6 years, founder level equity. I left 3 years in. And really, when the stock became valuable, I left most of my upside on the table because I couldn't wait to get back to doing philosophy full time. So I think Weber said this. He says, the Protestants and the Catholics have the exact opposite response when you raise their wages. The Protestant works more because his goal is in some sense to maximize, and the Catholic works less because his goal is to satisfy. And I suppose through that decision of the company became almost everyone, right, would like, now's the time to stay at this company. Like, we finally got it working. But for me, it was like, okay, I might have hit my minimum of the money I need. Now's the time to leave. Okay. And so I still face that decision of, do I want to go back to grad school? That's still something I want to do, and we should talk about that. Instead, I decided to do this public lecture series, partially because of the Girard lecture series and its success that it had gotten. It was 10 hours long, and it has about now 200K plus views. Like, when I did it, it was just like a passion project. I thought only the craziest weirdos like myself would be interested in that. But it got great views from a lot of people.
Hang on.
Yeah.
Let me challenge you on that. That's not the impression that I've ever gotten from you. I always get the impression from you and like our mutual friend David, rather that when you knew going into this, you were going to build something that was high production value. It was going to look and sound just like it needed to look and sound to hit hard, and you were going to produce it hard. And I feel like from the beginning, you were confident you were going to make a product that would crush it on YouTube, and that's what you did. And it worked, right?
Not the Girard lectures.
Are you kind of, is this like a false modesty, or what's going on here? What am I getting wrong?
I wish it were. Not the Girard lectures. So the Girard lectures, it was the passion project that gotten a lot more successful than it did. And let me be very clear here. And I think this is one thing that you and I talked before this podcast started, which is, I don't really care about raw numbers. I care a lot more about having the right quality of the right people that essentially I want to be friends with viewing my stuff. And so it wasn't just the raw number success that surprised me. It was the type of people who took out 10, 20, 30 hours of their lives to watch it, sometimes 2 or 3 times. And so what you are right, Justin, is that this current lecture series, I'm very confident in because of the Girard lectures, because I think they're going to do very well. But when I was making the Girard lectures, I was content of just putting something that I conceived to be beautiful out there. And that actually is the first reason why. That's by far the primary reason why the design, like, I put so much effort into the production, which is that I just want it to be beautiful. There are other benefits to it, and we can talk about it. In fact, I think there's even financial benefits to spending a lot of money on production value. But the primary reason is aesthetic. It's what Machiavelli said, that you feel like these books are so important, you put on your best suit when you discuss them.
This is great. Let's pause on this, though, because this is fertile terrain here. So what I'm trying to tease out of you, because I think it's just very interesting for the audience, and a lot of people in the audience are embarking on their own similar types of projects, trying to build some independent body of work on the internet. With your project so far, you've put a lot of resources into them from the beginning. From one sort of standard conventional wisdom around internet content and building brand, building a body of work on the internet, building an audience, whatever you want to call it. One common idea is that you should start small and you should iterate fast, and you should just use your iPhone real quick, and you should not really worry about this massive investment of resources, which you've embarked on from the beginning. Especially, you must have, I'm curious, like, you must have some sense of how this is going to pay for itself in the long run. Or is this just pure consumption expenditure? You're just like, I'm going to burn whatever amount of money I need to make this look good. Somehow it's going to pay for itself in some undetermined way. You must have, I'm presuming you have some kind of model of how it pays for itself. Just think, help us, because you're saying that you went into it with like low expectations and you thought only a few weirdos would be interested in it. But I kind of don't fully believe that, because you wouldn't invest so much in the early stages. So how do you think about all of that?
Right. So for the Girard lectures, that was my initial intention, which is I'm happy just putting something beautiful out there. With this, that's still the primary desire. I want to put something beautiful out there that I'm happy looking back on 10, 20, 30 years from now. And if this gets one magnitude less than the Girard lectures, but I'm happy with it, let me put it this way. If I had a choice in front of me of putting like a shameful clickbaity title versus like a dignified one that got 10% as much clicks, I would do the dignified one. But that's also what I was trying to get at with the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like, I don't need this thing to a shit ton of money for me now, given the company. Now, the funding model, and this is something that you asked about, is I'm getting very big checks of essentially patrons who are willing to support me. And that's kind of how the whole thing works. And this is also why I don't really care about the mass numbers, which is the people I want to reach and the people that can write big checks, they're going to be more attracted to the highbrow intellectual stuff, which is what I'm interested in. So that's what I'm trying to align. I'm trying to find my audience. I'm trying to find what I want to do, this sort of more artistic, beautiful style. And I also need to find the financial model that funds all of it. So to answer your question directly, right now, the Girard lectures were purely funded by grants, essentially. Just think the modern equivalents of the Renaissance model, right? By the way, that was another big advantage of building the company, is that I met all these, mostly people in tech, but also in finance, who were in their stage of their career where they were interested primarily in, not primarily, but in giving. What's funding this entire project right now is patronage. Now, I am hoping to open up other channels. One example is I think I'm going to put all my transcripts on Substack behind a paywall. So like, I don't know, $10 a month, $80 a year. And there is a world in which if there's enough people reading that, as you know, that could sustain itself. But my plan going forward is just keep raising patronage from foundations and individuals.
I see. Okay.
And so that is the primary thing. Now, with that said, and as our good friend David Perel, who I made the Girard Lecture Series, will tell you, once you have a high quality audience, there are so many ways to monetize that. You can, I don't know, I mean, ads would be the thing that is obvious. But again, I don't really want to do ads because I'm trying to create a work of art here. And so I'll pause there, but there's more to go into.
No, that's great. So it sounds like you have the intention of building some kind of monetization model around this over time to make it more sustainable. But right now you are totally agnostic about what that's going to look like. You're not worried about it right now.
There already is a business model, which is patronage.
Okay.
And that's the business model that has funded the entirety of the Renaissance, right? But yes, I am, to your point, trying to expand to other revenue sources, but I'm not in a rush, so to speak.
Great. Sure. Yeah. I was just curious about that, trying to paint the picture of what you're building and how you're thinking about it strategically, so we can all learn from how you're seeing it. There's so many different people trying to carve out space for themselves in this new world, and everyone's making different decisions and calculations based on what they're seeing. So I try to get an inventory of all the interesting people doing this sort of stuff.
Hey everybody, real quick, I finally finished writing my latest book, The Independent Scholar, and it's the best thing I've written, the most important thing I've written, because it compiles everything I've learned over the past 5 years, figuring out this new lifestyle / business model of mine, working full-time as an independent scholar outside of institutions and on the internet. Since I left academia 5 years ago, I've been experimenting like crazy, testing all different kinds of things. I've done books and courses and subscriptions, and I've tried it all. I've tested every model and I've learned so much. I've made so many mistakes, but I've also done things well, and I've earned a few $100,000 doing all these different things. Now I've really got the model down, the ideal model. I've narrowed it down to what works the best and what's most reproducible for most people. It's just a super practical, focused book, what works and what doesn't work in the most concise and practical format possible. So buy it, order it now online at otherlife.co/scholar. You can also just search for The Independent Scholar book. Maybe add Justin Murphy in there if you want to find it more easily. otherlife.co/scholar. Go buy it, The Independent Scholar, the ideal model. Everything I've learned over the past 5 years working full-time as an independent scholar. Thank you, I'm very proud of it. otherlife.co/scholar.
I had an interesting conversation several months ago, probably more than a year now, with Samo, who you probably know of. He has a very interesting model doing quite sophisticated sort of geopolitical research. And he also talked about patrons, and he talked about that for him, it's a little bit different. It's more like clients, but it's patrons as well. So many different ways to hack it. And I'm
Right.
very interested in building knowledge of how people are doing this kind of stuff. So go ahead.
And just to be clear here, I don't know that much about Samo's model, but to my understanding, it's more like consulting, where you hire him to explore a space. For me, it's the exact same model as if you give to an art museum. Like, you don't get anything. Like, you can come to my lectures if you want, but you are funding primarily, and this is why I go back to art the whole time, and hopefully why this is why. Now it's starting to make sense why I put so much emphasis on aesthetic value. This is primarily an artistic project. It's not a moral project. It's not a social political project. It's an artistic project. That these books are in some deep sense beautiful.
Okay, bring us into some of those first conversations you had with patrons. How do you make that approach? How do you make that ask? Obviously, without going into overly private details, tell us about how you think about that in terms of the kind of social elements, because there's always a kind of personal element. There's always some kind of implicit exchange element, but it's often implicit. So just because there are a lot of people out there who have some kind of interesting creative project. And yeah, they probably are only a few people removed from wealthy people who do have an inclination to give to worthy projects. But a lot of people have no idea how to broach those conversations. How did you think
Right.
about that then? And bring us into the room with you back then.
Well, the first thing I'll say is I think this model really only works if for a specific type of project, right? I'm not creating a podcast. I'm not here creating the John B show, right? Like I'm trying to rescue the key insights from these great books and trying to publicize like knowledge from the great thinkers that are still alive.
Okay, so
who study
point
them.
one is a pro-social contribution to humanity, not a personal brand building kind of operation.
Yeah,
For the
yeah.
obvious reasons, the first one makes much more sense to approach different stakeholders.
Yeah. The second one, is that the people who have funded this project so far, I'm hoping to expand my group beyond this. They know me and they're funding it for me, and so there's no real like tit for tat because I'm not giving them anything. I'm literally like the conversation is you give me money, I give you nothing. Does that sound like a good deal? And they only say yes because they know me, and so that's going to be quite hard to replicate. And for me, right, I knew these people, but because I built companies and I was in that social circle with them. To take a step back, I do think this is going to change once the content is already out, right? Because what's really cool, and Justin, you've been such a great influence for me, even to go on this, right? I think you're the first person whom I heard like independent scholar as well as full stack professor vocabulary that I've digested and tried to embody. And one thing that you mentioned a lot is being an independent scholar in this day and age is like building relationships at scale. If I have you in my ears for 20 hours listening to your podcasts, I'm already going to have a relationship with you. So actually, this is actually a good example. Some of the donations that I've gotten were from people who knew me from the Girard lectures. So in fact, most of it was from that. I guess what I'm trying to say is this patronage model, they're doing it for you. That's number one. Like you got to understand the patrons are funding this for you. And you need pre-existing relations that you can tap into. But those relationships can come from content because content is a way to build.
Right.
So I hope that's helpful.
No, this is great. And I think this is such a good topic for people to listen to because it's such a subtle thing. These sort of interpersonal subtleties around building relationships and getting to the point where you could confidently ask someone for a simple gift for a cultural project that you want to undertake. It's so subtle and people don't like to talk about it because it's kind of awkward sometimes. And there's no blog post out there where you can learn like how to secure a patron. It's too subtle for that. So that's why this conversation is very interesting. And I appreciate your frankness about it. I want to pause on something you said though, because it's so fascinating when you said, I just tell people I'm asking for your money and you're not going to get anything in return. I'm a proud Irish Catholic guy who's like, I don't have that kind of thing in me. So I'm curious, like literally.
My shamelessness.
Yes. Yeah. Teach us how do you say that? I'm really curious. How do you say that?
So the first thing I want to caveat, I don't think this is original or that original in the sense that, again, like all the museums are funded this way.
Right.
Like Columbia, Brown, Harvard, the Ivy League is funded this way.
You're absolutely right. It's a whole tradition. It's a known kind of way of funding such projects. So you're absolutely right.
And there are bodies of money. That's what foundations are, whose mission it is to give away money to fund projects that are pro-social. So that's the one thing I want to caveat is that this is now what might be new about this is applying this to the independent scholar sort of model, right?
Right. And something also worth distinguishing is you're not doing traditional nonprofit fundraising, I suspect, because obviously like one way to do this is, you make a list of all the foundations and writing the grant providing sort of organizations. And then you do the kind of nonprofit stump speech and you try to go, but we're talking about something different here. We're talking about, which is very relevant to this current moment in time. It's particularly germane to kind of internet savvy people like in our kinds of networks. It is a much more personal, private, quiet, sort of informal thing where you're going to certain dinners, you're meeting certain people, you're building companies. So we're talking about a different game than the traditional kind of nonprofit fundraising from institutions and grants. Like you've mentioned institutions and stuff, but what you're doing, I believe, is it's more subtle than that. So
Yeah,
since it's so hard for
right.
people to know the inner mechanics, give us more about how to make it work and what are the rules of this game and how to do it successfully.
I mean, honestly, I think the key lesson is you just got to ask. Like, there are like things that make it more or less subtle, but those are almost too person specific to give a general principle. One thing that surprises me is that people don't ask for things they want. Like, people don't go out there and ask the cute girl that they want to take on a date with. And sometimes they say no, but sometimes they say yes. It's just crazy to me that people don't ask for things they want. And I suppose from my perspective, this is not that different. So the first thing I'll say is you are right about the foundation versus individual thing. I do hope to eventually tap into the foundations, but that requires some kind of track record. And a good way to think about, I think, all of this is for-profit venture fundraising, where early on, especially if you have a really weird idea, right? And almost any independent scholar project that raises money in this way is a weird idea like mine is. You want individuals, right? You don't want the institutional investor who has layers of bureaucracy with associates and the VC firm making the decisions, who are risk averse, who don't get fired from their job. You want the individuals who will respect the type of risks you're taking. And that's also how my current base are people who have patrons without seeing anything. And then hopefully once the project is launched, I'll be able to tap into that foundation network. But the other big thing I'll say is social proof, right? Once you have one of these big vetted names, again, it's just like for-profit. It's just like for-profit venture fundraising. Once you have one of these big names, the second one is going to be a lot easier for it to get off. And again, if you don't have that early launch thing, you can have content out there already, right? You can record podcasts at very low cost and then expand there. But in terms of the actual the actual literal words to ask, it's probably so dependent. But it's literally just a form of, I'm doing this project for these reasons. Will you support this? And many people will, you got to be thick-skinned. So I don't think the Catholic is helping. But surprisingly, people do.
I think you're absolutely.
Let me say one more thing here. Obviously, you need to find people who are already interested in the things that you're engaged in. If you talk to a STEM guy about funding my humanities project, that's not going to resonate. But I think there's a deeper point here, which is you actually don't want. You don't want. There are some people that would give you money that you should not take money from. And that's the same as the venture as well, right? There are bad people that you don't want on your capital sheet, not because they're bad actors, but because they're not a good fit for your company. And so when I looked out for my initial set of patrons, it's just, I filter heavily for people who are interested in the humanities, because if they're not interested in the humanities, they're probably interested in this in some kind of political reason, right? Like, I want to spin the canon in a specific political way, but that's not the project I'm interested in. I want a general survey and an authentic survey to all of these authors. And that's why I started with Rousseau, traditionally considered on the left, and Nietzsche, traditionally considered on the right. I want to turn off patrons who want to fund an exclusively political project.
I think you're really onto something important when you emphasize that on some level, you just have to ask. And a lot of people just don't ask for anything. I think you're absolutely right that what I'm getting from your kind of case study so far is that if you are just simply confident in what you want to do, you genuinely believe that it's a kind of pro-social contribution to the culture, then if you have genuine relationships with people who are wealthy and are interested in giving, and they've said as much in different avenues, then you should simply just have the courage to go right up to them and ask. And most people are too afraid to do that. So in fact, not that many people really even do it. And if you just do it and you're confident and calm and respectful, I think what I'm hearing from you is you might just be surprised how straightforward it is.
Yes, obviously we don't want to make it seem too straightforward. You're going to get a lot of rejections, and you have to be thick-skinned about it. But if it's a legitimate project, of course, yeah. I had some people laugh me off, but it's interesting because to the just like independent scholars, there's some people in the academy. I told them what I want to do, which again, I think The primary reason I'm doing this, there's still I think a non-zero chance I'm going to get a PhD, is I simply want a broad survey into the canon. I have no idea what Pascal said. I have no idea what Berkeley said. And I think that's like outrageous that I don't know what these great thinkers, and those are just a few examples, right? I haven't read The Republic cover to cover. And I think that before I go down into narrow interests, and for me, that's more philosophy around philosophy of technology and recognition theory, that I want a proper survey. And I think this is the best way to get a survey into the canon, which is spending 6 weeks on each book, talking with all the top professors who've written secondary works on them. And when I told people in the academy this, some people said, so you're going to be a YouTube philosopher. And that's the type of reaction you're going to get when you're fundraise as well. So it's not like ask and you shall receive. It's ask and knock your head filled with blood, and then maybe you'll receive. But you need to ask, or else you will not receive.
That's all very rich and I think quite inspiring for people who are thinking about these types of projects and finding their own way. You know enough about me. I've carved out a different path. And as I said, I have a certain Irish Catholic pride. I could never ask anyone wealthy for anything at all as a gift. I'm too cowardly and prideful, and it's not a virtue.
You're not as shameless as I am. That's what I'm hearing.
Well, you can frame it in different ways, but I don't in any way say this claiming it to be a virtue. I see it much more. It's really an inhibiting thing more than anything. But point is, people play to their strengths and people have different callings. And I've always personally I'm excited and called forth by the challenge of economic independence combined with the scholarly life. And I'm excited by that challenge. And I'm called by that vision of, can I be a successful sort of small scale artisan of knowledge and insight? And as a writer, can you make the writing and the scholarly life float on its own terms in the contemporary economy in new ways, given all of our affordances? And I've just always had the hunch that there are interesting ways to make it work. So I'm dedicated to figuring that out. And that's my play on things. And it suits my temperament. I don't think it's better or worse, but that's why it's an interesting conversation.
Yeah, well, let me ask you this. A lot of people on Substack, right? I'm sure you'd consider Substack as one of these ways that a small artisan could keep him or herself afloat. Sure. A lot of the Substack, it's literally, or Patreon is the better example. A lot of people on Substack, they don't give their paid subscribers anything. The paid subscription is simply for a way for people to express their thanks. In a way, that's the exact form of what I'm suggesting here, but just in different check sizes and through different routes. So I don't think there's a difference in kind between this and Patreon.
It's a great point. It's a really important point. And I've always noted that myself as well. The only difference is, it's a really important point, Johnathan. And for people who are like building out a kind of monetized project, it's actually crucial to understand that like you might think of yourself as like providing a product to customers, but often you're not really. And if you overthink that element, you're going to be stressing yourself out in ways you don't necessarily need to. It is actually often much more like a donation. The difference is between the high touch interpersonal negotiations that one embarks on if you're going to like try to raise real gifts. That's sort of its own model and its own sort of challenges, and
that's right,
a certain kind of attitude and framing and all of that. Whereas when you build a kind of content system online, that is, it looks and feels much more like a business with customers paying for things. Yeah. But you're absolutely right. At the end of the day, the underlying sort of logic or psychology of the audience buying into your operation is actually more similar than people realize. So that's an absolutely important point.
And even in the academy, right? Because who funds our universities? It's not Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse, right? It's the same people that I'm raising money directly from. And obviously there's a layer in between the endowment as well as the hiring committee in universities. But you're always on this show, essentially, right? You're always trying to fundraise in some way. Now, the one thing I'll say is, I think what needs to come first before you think about any of this is, what do I want to do? And if I want to create, and I know, Justin, this is neither your nor my ambition, if I wanted to create a popular podcast that anyone would be glad to listen to, maybe Rogan or something like that, this would not be a great fundraising model for that. One is, I probably can make a lot more money if I truly am going to reach like tens of millions of dollars by selling them, I don't know, vitamins or something. The second one is, I just don't think people would be willing to fund that, because like, why am I funding two guys like just chatting, right? And so primarily, I think people should, Justin, your project is almost like having a deck or PDF showing people like, if this is the content you want, then these are the ways that you can fund it. If these are the content you want, then these are the ways that you can fund it. But I think that question should come first, which is, what do I want to do? And for me, I want to really understand these great books, and I want to help other people understand these great books like the back of their hand. And that's not going to have a public appeal. Like, I'm not going to be able, I don't think I'll be able to fund this on selling athletic greens, but that is primary. What do I want to do? That is primary.
And I think that's absolutely, important for people to think about as well. And you're right, it does explain some of the differences between our own orientations, because one of the drawbacks of approaching wealthy donors asking for gifts is it's a great model if it fits what you're doing and it fits your temperament, as it does for you, I think, quite perfectly. One of the drawbacks is that as you're pointing out, it really does need to be a kind of public service operation. And that's how you have to genuinely feel it. That has to be the genuine kind of intention, or else it's not gonna feel right for anyone, and it's probably not going to work out in any way. For me, I'm less pro-social, I think. I see the independent scholar as anti-social in a way, and that's the aspect of things that I'm interested in solving and building a reproducible playbook for, is like, how can the kind of militant, aggressive, kind of anti-social, truth-telling individual do that sustainably in a way that's unstoppable, and where you can also have a reasonably comfortable, economically secure life. That you're onto something, because that doesn't really work. You can't ask someone for a big gift, or like, hey, could you give me a lot of money so that I can be a wild individual saying whatever I want and kind of being this antisocial crazy guy? Like, it doesn't fit as right. So you're absolutely right, I think, about that.
Right. Well, I think there's something about what I'm doing right now which makes it a very no-brainer kind of target for this type of patronage. But maybe I do want to challenge a bit about your assumption as well, because most of the Renaissance, the wealthy, like the Medicis, just wanted the top thinkers around them, right? And so maybe it's not, I have the luck of being able to go to a very broad swath of donors who are interested in humanities, who immediately understand why it's good and noble to have accessible introductions to the great books out there. But if you're interested in, I don't know, artificial intelligence and technology, if you're interested in a specific political angle, left or right, there are ways to, I think, apply this model to that. I think it'll be more difficult and you're going to have to be more targeted, but there are ways as well, because, and again, the empirical evidence I'll point to is that that's how the Renaissance was funded. And most of them were doing just like weird stuff. It literally was like, fund me to do this thing. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. I just think it's interesting to note the different conditions, because there are always some trade-offs involved. And I think, like,
Totally.
in an ideal world, you're absolutely right. You can have these sort of donor relationships where there really are no strings attached, and you're really, for all intents and purposes, really quite free to pursue the work that you're saying that you'd like to pursue. On the other hand, of course, historically, we also know at some margins, there's always going to be some constraints. There's always social and political elements that are very subtle, but also omnipresent and inescapable in the final analysis. And I think for your project, there's just no problem with it, at least for the foreseeable future. But obviously, the history of patronage is rife with examples of conflicts as well. And
Totally.
And there are cases where people get into hot water because they upset their patron, or the demands of the patron become too onerous, and so on. So yeah, it's complicated.
And one thing to add here is that I think it was Michelangelo or something, when, I don't know if it was the Medicis who funded the David, but I think someone came to the David and said, the nose is too big. And it was like one of his patrons or someone very powerful. And the nose wasn't too big. It was too big because the angle that the person was seeing it was the wrong angle, right? It wasn't the ideal angle. And so, because this person was important and powerful, Michelangelo couldn't just say, you're stupid. So what he did was he grabbed a handful of dust, grabbed his pick, and then he started like banging it on without hitting the statue and letting the dust fall out on the other side. And then he said, how about this? And then he led the patron to the right angle, and the patron's like, voila, right? But again, this goes back to my suggestion about picking the right patron. It's almost like, once you are able to fundraise in this way, it's just like a for-profit venture scale business. It's just as important who you don't take money from of who you do. If you don't want patrons like giving you weird political directives or like giving you weird suggestions, then pick patrons who have good taste, right? And who have a track record of not like just interfering with your work.
So for someone like you who has a background in business and you're savvy with those elements, and now you're embarking on this full-time focused content operation online, I'm curious to mine your intuitions and observations around where you think this economy is going. Specifically, a very hot topic, of course, is higher education and all of that. And it sounds like you're still quite interested in that world and possibly traversing that world more thoroughly with some kind of research career of some kind. But I'm just curious, since you have one foot in this content economy now and you also know a thing or two about business, what else are you seeing in the creator economy and the current kind of trends of writing, of video, and are there interesting phenomena or trends that you're seeing that you're like, oh, that's going to be big, people are sleeping on that, or oh, that's not going to be big, people are like overhyped on that, or like this is going to replace this part of the university, but this part of the university is going to persist. I'm just curious what you're seeing and how you think about some of these questions that are hot topics.
Yeah, so the first thing I'll say is I'm probably the wrong person to ask about this because I do not engage with social media at all.
Hmm.
Like I block off all of my Twitter feed, I block off all of my Instagram feeds. I really have I don't really listen to podcasts. I literally just spend my time like reading the great books and reading secondary texts on the great books. This even goes as far as, so right now I'm trying to hire copywriters to turn my transcripts that I write and that I give into Twitter threads. I think even producing content, this is the exact same thing as the patrons, which is you got to be very careful what you don't do and what you don't expose yourself to. Like YouTube, having a 2-hour long conversation like this, giving a 2-hour lecture, that is a fitting medium for these ideas. It's 280 characters where you need to compete with someone who's scrolling away and the next tweet is Elon saying something ridiculous. That's not a good medium. That's a medium that you as an independent scholar shouldn't want to exist in. However, with that said, Twitter was probably one of the biggest growth methods that I've gotten through the Girard lectures. And so one way to tap into that is I literally hire copywriters who have proven track records of writing Twitter threads, give them my transcripts, and then say, just turn these into Twitter threads. Like, I don't want anything to do with this. So that's a caveat. Like, I have no idea what other people are doing other than my friends like yourself and David in the content game. So I have absolutely no idea.
Yeah. Let me put it this way. I'll rephrase it for you to give you something more to sink your teeth into. Isn't it just the case that right now, anyone who's in grad school, let's say, or they're in a PhD program or whatever, and let's say they're currently on some kind of trajectory to be a scholar of some kind, if they're talented, why would they not do what you're doing essentially?
Right.
I struggle to see. One obvious reason is just tradition, inertia, prestige, whatever. It's like they want to make their parents proud, and their parents think that being a professor is like the thing to do, or whatever. And that's a perfectly fine reason to do something, and it's a strong human motivator, that kind of stuff. So no disrespect to that, and that's one good reason. But like for anyone who's just thinking about these things from first principles and just wants to have the most brilliant, impactful, and brilliant sort of career as a writer, thinker, researcher in the public sphere, like, why would they not just do what you're doing or what I'm doing or some variation on all of these things? How do you think about that? Because I think you're more partial to the university. So just how do you think about that?
Yeah. So I am very partial to the universities. I think there's great scholarship being done there. In fact, if I could only talk to people inside or outside the universities, I'd be very sad, but I choose inside the universities versus outside. That's very narrowly beat out. Now, I think we need to separate your question of why shouldn't they do what I'm doing and why won't they do what I'm doing. And the why won't they do what I'm doing is obvious. It's mimesis. It's the lack of prestige.
Yeah, no, that's all astute and very reasonable. I see what you're thinking for sure. The university obviously has great advantages. And with my own journey, obviously, I know very well the decline of that mimesis enjoyment factor. I know it super clearly because I've been in both worlds, right? I have a beautiful life and I'm more successful in almost every way than I would have been if I stayed as a professor. Like I make more money now as an independent scholar than I would have had I stayed on as a professor. And I obviously have
much cooler people. Yep.
Yeah, and I'm, I write really freely, and I say things I could never say as a professor. And to me, it's a more full flourishing of my own kind of vision for my scholarly life. But it is a desert, basically, mimetically. And that's a very serious loss. As you said a minute ago, people are highly impressed by just brands and names of universities, and even just saying you're a professor or whatever makes people's eyes light up a little bit. Much less now than it used to, but nonetheless, still, that's a legible thing that people respect and whatever. And so you do lose something real when you lose those things, for sure, but you gain other things. And I think what's interesting about another thing you said is that it is interesting how Silicon Valley is kind of like the alternative pole. So that if you are academically sophisticated and you do have a genuine, sophisticated kind of scholarly project of some kind, or let's just say you have that kind of scholarly calling and you have real work and you have something real to say and you're capable, if you do want to defect from the institutional establishment of those things, namely academia, it is interesting. You will, if you're good and successful, that will basically manifest as currency in the Silicon Valley circles. And I didn't necessarily know that or predict that coming into it, but that's something that I've noted. And so maybe this is an interesting topic because this whole sociology is very fascinating. You look at people, companies and brands like A16Z kind of going more and more into media, let's say, and even the University of Austin, right, is a kind of university startup basically coming out of Silicon Valley attitudes in Silicon Valley. You too, you are kind of doing this Silicon Valley into academic kind of crossover type of project. And so I'm sort of surprised that you're not more bullish on all of that. Because the way I'm looking at things is like Silicon Valley is like only just beginning to rev up. Like I think over the next 10 to 20, 30, 40 years, Silicon Valley will increasingly be like a kind of almost like a breakaway civilization within America. Like all of the money and all of the power, I think, moving forward is going to be circulating in this kind of, I think, because it's increasingly the source of all new sort of economic value generation. And then you look at all the problems the university has had for so long and the whole complex, everything from the student loan system to the regulations to the wokeness and all that, all the nonsense. It's a whole long laundry list of interlocking kind of problems that seem to be getting worse and worse. When you look at all these things, I'm just sort of like someone like you, I see you potentially having a tremendous career as a public thinker, staying in the kind of Silicon Valley kind of power center and just developing that and going out further on that kind of world of things. So yeah, it's interesting that you don't see it that way.
So I do see it that way. I guess what I'm trying to say is, again, I think this is the whole crux of this interview, which is very helpful for me myself to clarify, is it depends on the project and the person. For what I'm doing right now, I'm on the Silicon Valley side, right? Why? Because many people in the real world want 2-hour introductions to the Republic, to the genealogy, to the first discourse, the phenomenology of spirit. I have a certainly secondary, but I think will become primary set of interests that is to do original philosophy around mostly the philosophy of technology and recognition theory. No one is going to be interested in reading unless they're already interested in my other stuff, right? So maybe there's a world in which I start off, I mean, this is how I'm thinking about it. I'm kind of glad I'm doing this right now in my intellectual development where I don't really know these books very well and I'm currently learning, because there will be a point where I get so bored of lecturing on Plato that I'm just not excited about doing that. And I want to do my own stuff. However, when I do that, if I just give you a 500-page treatise on the philosophy of technology, it's going to be a very specific set of people who are going to be interested in that. Now, if you watch my lectures for 20 years on Nietzsche and stuff, and then I come out with a scholarly book, maybe you'd be more inclined to read that. But I guess what I'm trying to say, and I'm going to respond directly to your Silicon Valley comment, which is I am extremely bullish there, which is why I went there in the first place outside of college as I began my career. But if you look at the things that people in Silicon Valley are interested in, it's just the tippy top. It's not even the tippy top. It's one slice of the tippy top of the humanities. If you wanted to just write for that type of audience, you are going to be incredibly constrained as an intellectual, and your development will be incredibly constrained as well. And that's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, time will tell. I think it's a reasonable perspective. I think on that last point in particular, I think I do see that very, very differently because the way I see it is like, you're alluding to this, but Silicon Valley as a whole is a very Philistine culture. There are very smart people,
yes,
very,
totally.
very smart, sharp people. And you could debate who those key individuals are or whatever, but there are some of the smartest, most independent thinkers in the country are in Silicon Valley. But as a whole, the average is very Philistine. I'm talking about like the whole bulk of like tech workers and in these companies and so on. So it's very Philistine. But to me, this is the best possible structure, right? Because you have people with really deep pockets who are really smart, and
Right.
they know a provocative thinker when they see one, and it resonates with them, and they want to follow it, and they want to be interested in that and support that in different ways. But then you also have this massive population of people who really need just like basic education because they're really quite unsophisticated, and they know it also, and they do have aspirations to be like more educated. So I see sort of Silicon Valley probably not seeding, but like being the economic basis for a massive decentralized archipelago of new institutions. And I think you already see it with things like Straight Press, and you see it with things like the A16Z Media Ventures. And you also just see it with Patronage. As you noted, a lot of the generous subscribers and donors to Substacks and various paid businesses and experiments that the new breed of internet intellectuals are building, a lot of the people paying for those things are coming out of tech, right? So that's the landscape I'm seeing. I think I see that only getting bigger and more sophisticated and getting more developed. I think in your case, what makes sense to me about how you're thinking about it is that you're still relatively a young guy, and I appreciate your humility as well, Johnathan. You see yourself as someone who's really just starting to learn about these things, and you speak about yourself in that with that humility, which I really respect and appreciate. And so I could see why someone like you would still want to do a PhD program, because you still just want to be surrounded by mentors who are very academically sophisticated, and you want their help and their training to become a more full-fledged public thinker and writer. So that makes perfect sense, because right now, most of those really good academic experts are still ensconced in the university. But I think
That's
fast
exactly right.
forward
Yeah.
10 years from now, 15 years from now, I think like the actual number of PhD level, professorial level, sort of independent scholars will be as numerous or almost as numerous as the numbers in the universities. And that's the puck that I'm skating towards in the future.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a future that excites me a great deal. I think people don't pay enough attention to the sociology of knowledge production. And this is my interview next week of, again, this Roman Republic of Letters. How did the great senators, the top men of action, also become some of the top scholars of the day? What are the, and I think you can see this, the actual type of work that's being produced, given their financial and sociology around knowledge production, right? One example is the great, we talked about this over dinner last week, the great cultural thinkers, right? Think about someone like Marx or Rousseau or Nietzsche. They're all kind of loners. And I don't think that's unrelated to the idea that the continental philosophy, again, painting with very broad strokes here, wants to upset your intuitions, right? They want to say, oh, you think A, but no, actually B. Whereas the Anglo school, and you think about Hume and Smith, these were people in large bureaucratic university departments. Anglo philosophy is using these crazy systems to justify the most sort of simple moral intuitions, right? Again, painting with very broad strokes here. And so I think having, when people say, why aren't there more interesting ideas in the humanities? It's because there's not as interesting funding models, right? And again, this is a very Marxist way of viewing the world, right? That the underlying structure determines the overall ideas and culture. And so I'm incredibly excited for this future. And I just want to make it clear to your audience, like, I am bullish on that future. In fact, I'm so bullish that I chose not to go into the academy. But I guess my caveat, again, is it depends on the work that you want to do. If you want to figure out like the essence of, I don't know, again, a narrow topic, go into the academy still. If you want a general education, which is what I'm doing, I think this is a perfect medium to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, you represent this sort of Silicon Valley dynamic that I'm describing even more than I do in a way. So even though you're still interested in the academy and for very good reason, which I never have any problem with that to this day, I chose to go a different way. I still have a lot of friends in the academy. It definitely has this place for certain types of people, depending on what your interests are. But yeah, you represent the Silicon Valley dynamic I was talking about even more than I do, just in the nature of your trajectory. So Johnathan, I want to let you go, but this was a really interesting conversation. I think we touched on a lot of things that are they're just not talked about very much. This is the really nitty gritty stuff that is really important to people who are pursuing a vocation as an independent scholar today. But it's confusing and it's weird and it's sometimes awkward for people to talk about. So it often doesn't get a lot of airtime on some of the bigger podcasts or whatever. But for my audience and for the type of people that we are, I think that this is a really interesting and rich conversation with a lot of non-obvious insights.
And I'm just glad that I'm giving back to the fountain which I originally drank, right? Again, I can't emphasize this enough. You were the first person to make me aware of independent scholars, right? You coined the term full stack professor. And we've been friends for now, 4 years almost, right? And so it was that germination was, obviously it wasn't the last straw on the camel's back, so to speak, but it was definitely, it helped me get here. So I'm glad I'm able to contribute
I
something
really
back to the
appreciate
community.
that. Thank you for saying that. Thank you for the kind words. And I've been inspired by you as well. I've definitely been interested in watching how you built this, and you're putting some fire under my ass in a way. Because I'm like, oh, I better increase my production values. I got to get some wood paneling behind me or something like that. So I appreciate how much effort you've invested in making your stuff really impressive on that level. I look forward to seeing the results. Best of luck to you, Johnathan, and stay in touch.
Great. Thank you so much.